The case file begins not with a scream, but with a silence. It begins with the private medical notes of a physician from a small seaside town. The year was 1881. The place was Bar Harbor, Maine. The notes concerned his final visit to the Cresswell Mansion, a sprawling clapboard home that watched the Atlantic with 100 empty windows. In his journal, Dr. Samuel Aldrich wrote that the silence inside that house was a living thing. It was heavier and more profound than the screaming that had summoned him there in the dead of winter. He noted that inside the main hallway, he discovered the 5 Cresswell sisters. They were standing in a perfect, rigid line, their eyes fixed only upon one another. He recorded in his careful, slanted script that he was certain they no longer recognized their own blood. He believed the bond of family, the memory of their shared lives, had become a forgotten language between them. If these are the stories that call to you, join our community of fellow investigators by subscribing. The town of Bar Harbor was different in the winter. It was a place stripped bare by the wind. The summer crowds were gone. The grand hotels were shuttered and silent. The life of the town retreated inward, hunkering down against the gales that came roaring off the gray and churning water. The trees on the coast were black and skeletal. The sky was the color of old iron for weeks at a time. The world was reduced to the cry of gulls and the relentless percussive crash of waves against the granite shore. It was a place of stark and lonely beauty. It was a place that felt ancient and isolated when the snows came. The town's economy, its very soul, was tied to 2 things. It was tied to the sea, and it was tied to the fortunes built upon that sea. The Cresswell family was the foremost example of this truth. Their wealth was old, earned through generations of shipbuilding. Their ships were known for their strength, for their ability to withstand the worst the Atlantic could offer. The family name was synonymous with power and resilience. Their home was a monument to that legacy. The Cresswell Mansion did not sit in the town proper. It stood alone on a high, windswept point of land, a sentinel overlooking the endless expanse of Frenchman Bay. It was a massive structure of white clapboard and dark green shutters, with steep gables and a forest of chimneys. To the townspeople below, it was a landmark. It was a symbol of a world beyond their own, a world of immense wealth and quiet privacy. They saw the lights burn in its many windows on dark nights. They saw the smoke curling from its chimneys. But few had ever been inside. The house kept its secrets, and the family kept to themselves, especially in the winter. Dr. Samuel Aldrich was the town's only physician. He was a practical man, a man of science and logic. For 30 years, he had served the people of Bar Harbor, from the wealthiest shipbuilder to the poorest fisherman's child. He was known for his calm demeanor and his steady hands. He carried a worn leather bag that smelled of antiseptic and wintergreen, a scent that had comforted 2 generations of island residents. It was a smell of reassurance, of order being restored. The call came late, well after midnight. The wind howled outside his small home, rattling the window panes in their frames. He was woken by a frantic pounding on his door. It was a young man named Thomas, a groundskeeper from a property neighboring the Cresswell estate. The boy was breathless, his face pale with fear and cold. He said there was screaming. He said it came from the Cresswell house. It was not the sound of a single person in pain, he explained. It was a chorus. A terrible, unified shriek that rose and fell with the wind. The doctor listened patiently. He asked the boy to be precise. He asked what it sounded like. The boy struggled for words. He said it sounded like 5 voices at once. He said it sounded like something was being torn apart. Dr. Aldrich dressed quickly. He did not ask any more questions. A deep and unwelcome feeling of dread settled in his stomach. This was not the first time he had been called to the mansion on a strange errand. He pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed his leather bag, and prepared his horse and buggy for the journey. The ride to the Cresswell Point was a battle against the elements. The wind was a physical force, pushing against the small buggy, trying to force it from the frozen, rutted road. Snow had begun to fall, thick, wet flakes that swirled in the lantern light and melted on his face. The horse was skittish, its ears twitching at the sound of the wind and the angry sea. The doctor held the reins tight, his knuckles white. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind was on the house. He thought of the 5 Cresswell sisters. He remembered them as children, with bright ribbons in their hair. He remembered them as young women, celebrated for their beauty and their education. They were accomplished musicians, fluent in French, possessed of a grace that seemed almost out of place in the rugged landscape of coastal Maine. But in recent months, something had changed. The change was subtle at first, a shadow behind the eyes, a conversation that ended too abruptly, a visit where the usual warmth was replaced by a strained and brittle formality. He had dismissed it then. He had attributed it to the isolation of the house, to the pressures of their social standing. He saw now that he had been wrong. He saw now that he had mistaken the symptom for the cause. As he neared the long, winding drive that led to the mansion, the world grew quieter. The trees thickened, blocking the worst of the wind. The snow fell in a soft, soundless curtain. The only sound was the crunch of the buggy's wheels on the fresh powder and the heavy breathing of the horse. And then he saw it, the house. It loomed out of the darkness, a vast, pale shape against the black sky. A few lights burned in the downstairs windows, casting a weak, yellow glow. They looked like the eyes of a creature watching him approach. He felt a profound sense of unease. It was the feeling of crossing a threshold into a place where the normal rules of the world no longer applied. He pulled the buggy to a stop before the grand entrance. The great oak doors were slightly ajar. A sliver of light cut across the snow-dusted stone steps. There was no one there to greet him. This was the first violation of protocol. In the Cresswell household, protocol was everything. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He grabbed his bag and walked up the steps. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The screaming had stopped. The silence that met him was absolute. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, watchful quiet that seemed to press in on him from all sides. The entrance hall was immense, the ceiling lost in shadow far above. A grand staircase swept upward into the darkness. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. The fires in the massive hearths must have died hours ago. The only light came from a single gas lamp on a far wall. It flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed and twisted like living things. He saw the servants first. They were huddled together by the entrance to a service corridor. There were 3 of them. A cook, a housemaid, and a butler. Their faces were ashen. The butler, a man named Jennings who had served the family for 40 years, simply pointed. His hand trembled. He did not speak. Aldrich followed his gaze. He looked down the length of the main hallway, and he saw them, the 5 Cresswell daughters. They stood in a line. It was not a casual arrangement. It was a formation, precise and unnatural. Margaret, the eldest, was at the head. Then Catherine, then Elizabeth, then Anne, and finally, little Mary, who was only 16. They were all dressed in simple white nightgowns. Their long hair was unbound, falling around their shoulders. Their feet were bare on the cold, polished floorboards. They were perfectly still. They did not seem to be breathing. Their faces were pale and expressionless, like porcelain masks. But it was their eyes that held him. It was their eyes that stopped the air in his lungs. They were not looking at him. They were not looking at the servants. They were not looking at the door. Each sister was staring intently at the sister next to her. Margaret stared at Catherine. Catherine stared at Elizabeth. Elizabeth at Anne. Anne at Mary. And Mary, at the end of the line, stared at the empty space beside her, as if a sixth person was meant to be there. Their gaze was not one of recognition or communication. It was a look of intense, detached scrutiny. They were studying one another as a scientist might study a strange and unfamiliar specimen. There was no love in their eyes. There was no fear. There was no anger. There was only a vast, chilling emptiness. Dr. Aldrich was a man who had seen death. He had seen madness born of fever and grief. He had seen the terrors of the human mind turned inward, but he had never seen this. This was something else. This was an ordered collective madness that defied explanation. He cleared his throat. The sound was small and lost in the cavernous space. He said the eldest sister's name, Margaret. He said it was Dr. Aldrich. He said he was here to help. There was no response, no flicker of recognition, no movement at all. He walked slowly toward them. His footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. The sound felt like a profanity in the sacred silence. He stopped a few feet away. He could see their faces more clearly now in the dim, flickering light. Their pupils were dilated wide and black, swallowing the color of their irises. It was as if they were staring into a profound darkness that only they could perceive. He reached out a hand, a gesture he had made 1,000 times to calm a frightened patient. He meant to touch Margaret's shoulder, to offer a point of human contact in this cold, sterile tableau. But he stopped. He could not bring himself to do it. To touch her felt like a transgression. It felt like interfering with a delicate and terrible process that was already underway. He saw then that this was not a matter for his medicine bag. This was not a sickness of the body. It was a sickness of the soul, and it was a contagion. It had claimed all 5 of them at once. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a man of logic and reason adrift in an ocean of the impossible. He observed every detail, the way their hands hung limp at their sides, the perfect alignment of their feet, the way the shadows cast by the gas lamp made their faces look gaunt and hollowed out. He was witnessing the end of a family, the quiet, orderly dissolution of the Cresswell line. He backed away slowly. He turned to the servants. He spoke in a low, steady voice. He told them to light the fires. He told them to watch over the young women. He told them not to touch them. He said he would return in the morning. He knew it was a lie. He knew there was nothing he could do. He walked out of the house, back into the snow and the wind. The cold felt clean. It felt real. He did not look back at the mansion as he drove away. He did not want to see its vacant, watching eyes. He returned to his small office. The fire had burned down to embers. He lit a lamp and sat at his desk. He opened his private journal, the one where he recorded the cases that disturbed him, the ones that lingered in his thoughts. He dipped his pen in the inkwell. The scratching of the nib on the page was the only sound in the room. He described the scene in the hallway. He described the sisters' eyes, their posture, their terrifying stillness. He wrote that he had never felt so useless as a physician, so utterly powerless in the face of an affliction. He wrote about the silence, how it was not an absence of sound but a presence. And then he wrote the final lines of the entry. He noted that this was not the first time he had been called to the Cresswell house to witness something strange. It was merely the most profound. He wrote that he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that this would be his last visit. He did not mean that he would refuse to go back. He meant that the girls he had known were already gone. He meant that whatever was left of them in that hallway was beyond his reach, beyond anyone's reach. It was the last time he would see the Cresswell daughters. He would only ever see the things that wore their faces. He closed the journal. He sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to the wind and thinking of 5 young women standing barefoot in a cold, silent house, staring at each other as if they had never met. The story had already ended. He was just there to record the epilogue. Dr. Samuel Aldrich's journal was bound in dark green leather, the same color as the shutters on the Cresswell mansion. The pages were thick and creamy, filled with his precise, disciplined script. It was a record of facts, a log of fevers, fractures, and births. But in the back, separated by a blank leaf of paper, he kept another kind of record. He wrote of the things that had no place in medicine. He wrote of the events that logic could not explain. It was here, in these hidden pages, that the true story of the Cresswell daughters began, long before the screaming and the final silent gathering in the hallway. The account started months earlier, in the late summer of 1880. The air was still warm and smelled of salt and drying pine needles. The sea was a deep, placid blue. It was a time of peace. And it began with the eldest sister, Margaret Cresswell. Margaret was 22 years old. She was the anchor of the 5 sisters. She was serious, dutiful, and possessed of a quiet intelligence that often made her seem older than her years. She managed the household accounts with their mother and was a gifted pianist. Her music was the soul of the house in the evenings. It was a sound of order, of beauty, of everything in its proper place. The humanizing detail, the memory Dr. Aldrich clung to, was of her laugh. It was a rare thing, but when it came, it was full and genuine. He remembered seeing her on the lawn with her younger sisters, her usual composure broken by a moment of simple joy. Her head was thrown back, her face turned to the sun. In that moment, she was not the stoic eldest daughter. She was just a young woman, alive and happy. That was the Margaret he remembered. That was the Margaret who began to hear the voices. She told him about it during a routine visit he made in September. Her mother, Eleanor Cresswell, had requested he check on a minor cough that was lingering with the youngest, Mary. After he had examined the child and declared her healthy, Margaret asked to speak with him alone. They stood in the grand library, a room paneled in dark, fragrant cedar. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She seemed hesitant, embarrassed. She told him it had started a few weeks prior. It only happened late at night, in the hours between midnight and dawn when the great house was utterly still. She said she would be lying in her bed, on the edge of sleep, and she would hear something. At first, she thought it was the wind. The house was old. It was full of groans and sighs as it settled on its foundation. She said she told herself it was just the sound of the sea, a trick of the acoustics in the old walls. But the sound was too precise. It was not a moan of wind or a creak of wood. It was a whisper. And it was her name, Margaret. She said it was quiet, barely audible, like a breath against her ear. She would sit up in bed, her heart pounding. She would listen. The house would be silent. The only sound would be the distant, rhythmic wash of the waves on the shore. She checked her room meticulously. She looked for drafts. She made sure the window was sealed tight. She even put out a small trap, convinced it must be a mouse scrabbling in the wall. The trap remained empty. The whispering continued. It was always the same. Her name, spoken on a single, drawn-out exhalation. Aldrich listened patiently. He asked her questions. He asked if she had been under any strain. He asked if she was sleeping well. He asked about the quality of the voice. Was it male or female? She could not say. It had no gender. It had no tone. It was just a sound shaped into her name. She admitted that her sisters thought she was being foolish. She had confided in the second eldest, Catherine, one evening. Catherine, who was more worldly and spirited than Margaret, had laughed. She had told Margaret she was spending too much time with her ledgers and her serious music. She said Margaret needed to read a romance novel and stop inventing ghosts in the walls. Margaret had tried to laugh with her, but the fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She felt isolated. She felt as if she were the only one awake in a sleeping house. Dr. Aldrich reassured her. He told her that the mind could play tricks, especially when one was tired. He gave her a mild tonic to help her sleep and told her to focus on her music, to fill the house with sound. He wrote in his journal that he believed it was a simple case of anxiety, a manifestation of the pressures of her position as the eldest. He noted that her fear, however, seemed disproportionate to the cause. Her eyes held a shadow he did not like. He left the mansion that day feeling a small, nagging sense of unease. He had offered a diagnosis, but he was not entirely convinced of it himself. 2 weeks later, the laughter in the house stopped. Catherine Cresswell stopped laughing. Catherine was 20. She was the opposite of Margaret in many ways. Where Margaret was reserved, Catherine was vibrant. She loved to ride horses along the beach. She loved to attend the summer dances. Her presence was like a bright flame in the quiet, stately rooms of the mansion. She was the one who teased her sisters, who coaxed smiles from their stern mother, who filled the spaces between Margaret's solemn piano pieces with her own light, cheerful melodies on the flute. She was fiercely protective of her sisters, but she was also a pragmatist. She did not believe in ghosts. She believed in what she could see and touch. One night, she was sitting up late, reading by the light of a single candle in her room. The rest of the house was deep in slumber. The book was a novel from London, full of wit and romance, and she was entirely absorbed. The only sound was the turning of the pages and the gentle sigh of the ocean far below her window. Then she heard it. A whisper, as soft as moth wings against a window pane. Catherine. Her head snapped up. She froze, the book falling from her lap. The sound had been so close, so intimate. It was as if someone were standing right behind her chair. She held her breath, listening. Silence. A profound, absolute silence. She told herself it was nothing. It was her imagination, influenced by Margaret's strange stories. She was tired. She had been reading for too long. She picked up her book, but the words on the page no longer made sense. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. 10 minutes passed. The silence stretched. She began to relax. She told herself she had been foolish. And then it came again. Catherine. This time, it was followed by something else. A second whisper, so faint she almost missed it. It was like an echo of the first, but different. It was a murmur, formless and sibilant. Two sounds. A name and its shadow. She threw the book down. She fled from her room, her bare feet making no sound on the thick hall runner. She did not go to her mother. She went to Margaret's room. She opened the door without knocking. Margaret was sitting up in bed, awake, her face pale in the moonlight that streamed through her window. She was staring at the wall. She did not seem surprised to see her sister. It was as if she had been expecting her. Catherine did not need to speak. Margaret just looked at her, and her expression was one of deep, sorrowful understanding. Catherine began to weep. They were not the tears of a frightened girl. They were the tears of someone who had just understood a terrible truth. She told Margaret she was sorry. She said she was sorry for laughing. Margaret simply held her, and the two sisters sat together in the moonlight, listening to the silence of the house, which was no longer empty. The matriarch of the family, Eleanor Cresswell, was a woman forged from the same iron will as the shipbuilders who had founded their fortune. She was tall and slender, always dressed in dark, severe colors. Her gray hair was pulled back so tightly that it seemed to pull at the skin of her temples. She governed her household and her daughters with an unwavering belief in order, propriety, and the suppression of all unpleasantness. Weakness was a failing. Emotion was an indulgence. The Cresswell name was a fortress, and she was its commander. She learned of the whispers not from her daughters, but from a servant who overheard Catherine's tearful confession to Margaret. Eleanor did not confront her children. She did not offer comfort or seek an explanation. Her response was swift and absolute. At dinner the following evening, a meal that was usually a formal but pleasant affair, she laid down the law. The dining room was silent, except for the clinking of silver against porcelain. The sisters were tense, picking at their food. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her back ramrod straight. She looked at each of her daughters in turn. Her gaze was cold and hard as granite. She said that there would be no more talk of nocturnal fancies. She said the house was old, the wind was loud, and their imaginations were running wild. She declared the subject closed. She said it was not to be mentioned again, not in the hallways, not in their rooms, and especially not at her table. Her voice was not raised. It was low and controlled, which made it all the more powerful. It was a command, not a request. The younger sisters, Elizabeth, Anne, and Mary, looked down at their plates, confused and intimidated. Margaret and Catherine said nothing. They simply stared at their mother. Dr. Aldrich had been invited to that dinner, a customary gesture of thanks for his care of Mary. He witnessed the entire exchange, and he wrote about it in his journal that night with a sense of profound disquiet. He wrote that he had studied Eleanor Cresswell's face as she spoke. He saw the pride. He saw the demand for control. But underneath it, he saw something else. He saw a flicker of raw, undisguised terror in her eyes. It was a look he had seen in the eyes of a trapped animal. It was the frantic, desperate fear of a leader who sees a mutiny she cannot quell, a force she cannot name. He wrote, "Her silence was not of disbelief, but of fear." It was the fear of a woman who knew her fortress had already been breached from within. She was not silencing a fantasy. She was trying to starve a truth, hoping it would die if it was not fed with words. She was wrong. The silence did not kill the whispers. It only made them louder. Aldrich continued to visit the house through the autumn, under various pretexts. He was monitoring Mary's lingering cough. He was checking on Eleanor's seasonal headaches. He used these visits to observe. He saw the change in the house. The easy laughter was gone. The music had stopped. Margaret no longer played the piano. Catherine's flute lay silent in its case. The sisters moved through the grand rooms like ghosts, speaking in low voices, their eyes constantly darting toward the walls, the corners, the empty spaces. The fear was a poison that had contaminated the air itself. It was during one of these late October visits that Aldrich made the note in the margin of his journal. He had been reviewing his conversations with Margaret and now with Catherine. He wrote down their descriptions of the phenomenon, a single whispered name. And then he remembered what Catherine had said about the second sound, the echo, the formless murmur that followed. He asked Margaret if she had experienced the same thing. She grew very pale. She nodded. She said that for her, too, the voice was not alone. It was always a pair, one clear, one a half-formed shadow of a sound. He sat in his study late that night, the lamp hissing softly, the journal open before him. He stared at his own handwriting. A pattern was emerging. It was not a simple haunting. It was not a shared delusion. It was something organized, something with a structure. He picked up his pen, and in the small space on the edge of the page, he wrote the 7 words that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He wrote, "The voices always spoke in pairs." A cold dread washed over him as he wrote it. It was the dread of a mathematician who finds a terrible and perfect symmetry in an equation of madness. 2 voices for Margaret, 2 for Catherine. It was a pairing, a bonding. The house was not just haunted, it was being courted. The whispers were not a threat, they were an invitation. And he knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, that it was only a matter of time before the other 3 sisters began to hear their own names called from the quiet, waiting walls of the house. The contagion was spreading. The silence Eleanor Cresswell had commanded was the perfect vessel for it to grow. The winter of 1881 was not just a season of cold and snow. In the memory of Bar Harbor, it was the season the Cresswell mansion went silent. The music stopped. The laughter ceased. The lights in the grand windows seemed to burn with a dimmer, more watchful glow. The silence that Eleanor Cresswell had demanded became the house's new master. But it was not an empty silence. It was a listening silence. A silence waiting for a sound. Dr. Samuel Aldrich felt it every time he visited. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The house was listening, and so were the 3 remaining sisters. The contagion, as Aldrich had privately termed it, did not take hold of them all at once. It seeped into the household slowly, a quiet and patient tide. It claimed them one by one, following the precise, descending order of their births. After Catherine, it was Elizabeth. Elizabeth Cresswell was 18 years old. She was the family's artist, a gentle, dreamy soul who spent her days with charcoal and sketchbooks. She was shy and retiring, happiest when she was capturing the stark beauty of the Maine coast on paper. Her humanizing detail was a simple one. She had a habit of tucking a wildflower behind her ear when she walked the grounds, a small spot of color against her dark hair. It was a private, innocent gesture of beauty in a world that felt increasingly gray. Her surrender to the whispers came not with tears or a frantic confession, but with a quiet, unsettling change in her art. One morning, the servants found her in the sunroom, a space once filled with her beautiful, realistic landscapes of the sea and shore. But on this day, her easel held something different. It was a large charcoal drawing, executed with a frantic, feverish energy. It was a depiction of a sound wave, a series of sharp, jagged peaks and valleys, rendered in stark black and white. When her mother asked her what it was, Elizabeth did not look up from her work. She said it was a picture of her name. She said it was what it looked like when the wall said it. After Elizabeth, it was Anne. Anne was 17. She was the most devout of the sisters, a pious girl who found comfort in prayer and the quiet solitude of the family's small, private chapel. She was kind and empathetic, often acting as a peacemaker between her more volatile siblings. She was the one who would bring a blanket to a sleeping servant or read to her younger sister Mary when she was ill. Her faith was her shield, but it was not strong enough. Her conversion was marked by a chilling act of blasphemy. One Sunday morning, the family found her in the chapel. She had taken the heavy, leather-bound family Bible from the lectern. With a small, sharp penknife, she had meticulously, surgically, cut her own name, Anne, from every page where it appeared. The tiny, excised words lay in a neat pile on the velvet altar cloth. When Father Alistair Finch, the young, scholarly priest who sometimes visited the family, asked her why she had done such a thing, her answer was simple and direct. She said the name no longer belonged to her. She said it belonged to the Whispers now. And finally, there was Mary, the youngest, the baby of the family, only 16. Mary was a bright, curious girl, full of life and questions. She had been sheltered from the growing strangeness in the house, protected by her older sisters and the stern edicts of her mother. But the sickness in the air was too pervasive. It found her, too. Her symptom was the most direct, the most literal. She simply began to mimic. She would stand behind one of her sisters for hours, a small, silent shadow, perfectly mirroring every gesture. If Elizabeth tilted her head to listen to the wall, Mary would tilt her head at the exact same angle. If Catherine paced the length of the hall, Mary would pace behind her, her steps falling in perfect, unnerving synchrony. She was no longer a person, she was a reflection. By the first thaws of spring, the transformation was complete. All 5 sisters had succumbed. The house now operated under a new and terrible rhythm. It was a symphony of madness, conducted by an invisible hand. The individual personalities of the girls had been erased. The vibrant, distinct young women Dr. Aldrich had known were gone, replaced by 5 components of a single malfunctioning organism. They moved through the house in a state of shared consciousness. They would often stand together in a room for hours, silent, their gazes unfocused, as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. Their movements became synchronized. If one sister raised a hand to touch her hair, the others would do the same. A fraction of a second later, a cascade of identical gestures flowing down the line of their ages. It was a horrifying, graceful ballet of insanity. Their speech, once articulate and lively, became fractured and strange. They spoke in unfinished sentences, starting a thought that another sister would complete, or sometimes all five would speak a single word in unison, a chorus that was both perfect and deeply disturbing. They would trail off mid-sentence, their eyes glazing over, as if the words they were about to say had been stolen from their minds. The servants, a loyal but terrified group, reported these behaviors to Dr. Aldrich in hushed, frightened tones. They spoke of the girls' new habits, how they no longer slept in their beds, but would often be found curled together on the floor of a single room, a tangle of limbs and hair, like a litter of sleeping animals. The most consistent and unsettling new ritual was their nightly vigil. Every night, without fail, as the moon rose over the Atlantic, the five sisters would rise from wherever they were in the house. They would walk in a silent procession to the east wing, to the long row of tall windows that faced the sea. There, they would stand side by side, shoulder to shoulder, and stare out at the black horizon. They would not move. They would not speak. They would simply gaze at the dark, empty expanse of water for hours. Their faces, illuminated by the pale moonlight, were blank and serene. It was as if they were waiting for something to rise from the depths. It was as if they were keeping an appointment. The servants' whispers began to change. At first, they had spoken of ghosts in the walls. Now, they spoke of something else. They said the house was no longer the source of the trouble. They said the whispers had migrated. They swore that on still nights, when the wind was low, you could hear the voices calling from the sea. They said the names of the five sisters were carried on the salt spray. They said the ocean itself was calling to them. Dr. Aldrich documented all of this in his journal. He filled page after page with the servants' reports and his own observations. His entries became less clinical, more searching. He felt he was no longer a physician recording symptoms. He was an archivist of a slow, unfolding tragedy. He felt a growing sense of guilt, a professional and personal failure. He searched his memory, trying to pinpoint the moment when he could have intervened, the sign he should have recognized. His mind kept returning to his very first visit, months ago, when Margaret had first confided in him. He remembered the library, the afternoon sun, the fear in her eyes. But he remembered something else now, a detail he had dismissed at the time as insignificant. He remembered looking closely at her eyes as she described the whispers. He had noted her pupils. They had been dilated, wide, and black. He had assumed it was a physical reaction to her fear, a simple fight-or-flight response. He saw now that he was wrong. It was not a reaction. It was an action. Her pupils had dilated because she was staring into a darkness that was present in the room with them, a darkness that only she could see. Her eyes were not reflecting the sunlit library. They were focused on an interior landscape of absolute shadow. That was the beginning. That was the first sign that something had taken root inside her. It was not a sound she was hearing. It was a presence she was seeing, a void she was looking into, and it had been looking back. He wrote in his journal that he should have known then. He should have understood that this was not a matter of the mind, but of the senses. Her perception of reality had been fundamentally altered. The world she inhabited was no longer the same as his. He realized with a cold, sinking certainty that the madness was not a descent into chaos. It was a journey toward a different kind of order. The synchronized movements, the shared sentences, the nightly vigil at the windows. These were not symptoms of a disease. They were the rituals of a new faith. The girls were not losing their minds. They were being initiated into something else. They were learning a new language, a new way of being, and the source of that initiation, the thing that called to them, was not in the walls anymore. It was out there, in the vast, cold, and patient darkness of the Atlantic. The house was merely a waiting room. The true destination lay beyond the shore. He saw the progression with a terrible clarity now. The whispers in the walls were the first call. The nightly vigil was the answer. The mimicked movements and fractured speech were the practice, the rehearsal for a final, unified act. He did not know what that act would be. But as he looked out his own window at the gray, churning sea, he felt a dread that was as deep and as cold as the water itself. He was watching 5 sisters prepare for a journey, and he was utterly powerless to stop them. He ended his entry that night with a sense of foreboding. He wrote that the spring had come, but in the Cresswell house, it was still the dead of winter. The world was coming back to life, but the 5 sisters were moving further and further into a silent, frozen world of their own. A world that was waiting for them just beyond the black horizon. The storm arrived in late April, a sudden and violent relapse into winter. It was not a normal spring storm of cleansing rain and blustering winds. This was something different. It was a storm of unnatural fury, a malevolent entity that fell upon the coast of Maine with a purpose. The sky turned the color of a bruise, a deep, sickly purple gray. The sea, which had been placid for days, rose up in a rage, its surface churning into a landscape of jagged, frothing peaks. The wind did not howl. It shrieked, a high, piercing sound that felt like a needle in the ear. It tore at the ancient trees on the Cresswell Point, ripping branches away and sending them spinning into the gray air. To the townspeople of Bar Harbor, it was a terrifying display of nature's power. They bolted their doors and shuttered their windows, listening to the storm's assault. But at the Cresswell mansion, the storm was not just outside, it was inside too. The sound of the rain was the most peculiar thing. It did not fall with the soft, familiar patter of a spring shower. It came in horizontal sheets, driven by the gale-force winds, and it struck the hundreds of windows of the vast house with an incredible force. It created a sound that was not like water at all. It was a sharp, piercing, almost metallic hiss. It was like handfuls of sand being thrown against a pane of glass. It was a constant, unnerving, sibilant sound that filled every room, every hallway, every corner of the house. It was the sound of a million tiny whispers. For the 5 Cresswell sisters, this sound was a revelation. They had been in their usual state of quiet, watchful stillness when the storm began. But as the hissing of the rain on the glass grew louder, a change came over them. They became agitated. They paced the rooms, their movements no longer synchronized but jerky and individual. They would stop and press their ears against the cold window panes, their eyes wide, their expressions a mixture of terror and ecstatic recognition. They began to speak, their fractured sentences overlapping into a cacophony of fear. Elizabeth, the artist, said that the colors were wrong. She said the whispers had a color now, and it was the color of broken glass. Anne, the devout one, kept repeating a single phrase. She said they were inside. She said they had finally gotten inside. It was Margaret, the eldest, who gave the phenomenon its name. She stood in the center of the grand drawing room, her hands pressed over her ears, and she declared in a loud, clear voice that the voices were inside the glass. The storm was not just a storm, it was a carrier. The rain was not just water, it was a medium. The whispers were no longer in the walls or in the sea. They had found a new home in every single window of the house. Eleanor Cresswell, who had watched her daughter's descent with a stony, terrified denial, was finally broken by this new development. The sight of her 5 children caressing the windows, listening to the hissing rain as if it were a sacred sermon, shattered her composure. She saw that her strategy of silence had failed. The madness had not only grown, it had evolved. It was now interacting with the physical world in a way she could not ignore. Desperation drove her to action. She summoned the remaining servants, her voice trembling but still full of command. She gave a single, frantic order. Every mirror in the house was to be covered. Every pane of glass that could reflect an image was to be blinded. She had a desperate, unformed theory that the reflections were somehow part of the problem, that the glass was not just a window to the outside world, but a mirror to the inner world of her daughter's madness. The servants worked with a frantic haste, their fear a palpable thing in the air. They pulled heavy velvet curtains across the tall windows. They draped white linen sheets over the gilded mirrors in the hallways and the dressers in the bedrooms. They even took down the framed portraits of their ancestors, the ones protected by glass, and turned them to face the wall. Within an hour, the entire mansion was shrouded. The grand rooms were plunged into a gloomy, perpetual twilight. The only light came from the flickering gas lamps, which cast long, distorted shadows on the cloth-covered walls. The house felt like a tomb. It felt like it was already in mourning for the family it contained, and for a brief, hopeful period, it seemed to work. The change in the sisters was immediate and dramatic. As the last mirror was covered, a profound quiet fell over them. The agitation vanished. The frantic pacing stopped. They ceased their litany of fractured sentences. They seemed to relax, their bodies losing the terrible tension that had gripped them. For the first time in months, they slept. They slept deeply, in their own beds, for 2 full days and 2 full nights. They ate the food that was brought to them. They spoke to each other in quiet, almost normal tones. It was a fragile, whispered version of their former selves, but it was a return nonetheless. A small, tentative peace settled over the house. The storm continued to rage outside. The rain still hissed against the shrouded windows, but inside, there was a stillness. Eleanor Cresswell allowed herself a sliver of hope. She watched her daughters, her heart aching with a desperate, cautious optimism. She thought that perhaps she had found the key. Perhaps by blinding the house, she had blinded the madness as well. Dr. Aldrich was called to the house on the 2nd day of this strange calm. He found Eleanor in the library, a single lamp burning on her desk. She told him what she had done. She spoke of the sisters' sudden improvement. She asked him if it was possible. She asked if a cure could be so simple. The doctor was a man of science. He did not believe in curses or voices in the glass. He examined the sisters. He found their pulses to be slower, their breathing more regular. The frantic, hunted look in their eyes had been replaced by a weary calm. He could find no medical explanation for the sudden remission of their symptoms, but he was a man who had lived on the coast of Maine his entire life. He knew that the sea and the sky could hold sway over the minds of men in ways that science could not measure. He felt the fragile hope in the house, but he did not trust it. He wrote in his journal that the quiet felt unnatural. It was not the calm of recovery. It was the calm at the eye of a storm. He felt that the house was holding its breath, waiting for the other side of the hurricane to hit. His fears were realized on the third night. The storm outside reached its crescendo. The wind screamed with a new, unholy intensity. The rain against the glass sounded like a million shattering shards. And inside the house, something broke. What happened next was pieced together from the terrified accounts of the servants, who had locked themselves in their quarters, and from the reports of the neighbors who lived a half-mile down the road. It began with a sound, a single, unified ripping sound that echoed through the entire mansion. It was the sound of the 5 sisters, acting as one, tearing the cloth coverings from the windows and the mirrors. They moved through the darkened house with a silent, terrifying purpose. They went from room to room, pulling down the heavy velvet curtains, ripping the linen sheets from the mirrors, exposing the glass to the storm and to themselves. And then came the second sound, the sound of shattering. They did not use tools. They did not use furniture. They used their own bodies. They threw themselves against the tall windows. They smashed their fists and elbows into the gilded mirrors. They shattered every single pane of glass in the Cresswell mansion. The sound carried on the wind, a symphony of destruction that was heard even by the neighbors. They said it sounded like the house itself was screaming in agony. When the last pane of glass was broken, a new and terrible silence fell. The neighbors, peering from their own windows, saw a sight that would be burned into their memories for the rest of their lives. The lights inside the Cresswell mansion were still on. Through the jagged, empty frames of the windows, they could see the 5 sisters. They were standing in the grand rooms, barefoot, amidst the glittering fields of broken glass. The shards covered the floors like a carpet of diamonds. The wind and rain swept through the house, whipping their nightgowns around their bodies, plastering their long hair to their faces. But they did not seem to feel the cold. They did not seem to feel the pain of the glass cutting into their feet. Their faces were turned skyward, toward the angry, bruised heavens. Their mouths were open, as if they were trying to catch the rain on their tongues. They looked to the horrified onlookers like they were drinking the storm. They were no longer listening to the voices. They had become one with them. The glass, which had been the vessel, was now gone. The barrier between their world and the world of the whispers had been shattered forever. The brief respite was over. The fake resolution had dissolved into a new and more profound level of horror. The house was now open. It was exposed to the wind, to the rain, and to the calling sea. And so were the 5 sisters who stood within it, their faces upturned, welcoming the chaos as a long-awaited absolution. They were no longer the Cresswell daughters. They were conduits for the storm. The aftermath of the storm was a period of grim, accelerated decay. The night of the glass rain, as the townsfolk came to call it, was not the end. It was the beginning of the final, terrible chapter in the story of the Cresswell daughters. The mansion, with its 100 broken windows, stood like a skeleton on the point of land. It was a ruin, open to the elements. The wind howled through its empty eyes. Rain soaked the fine carpets and warped the polished wooden floors. The house was dying, and its occupants were dying with it. In the weeks that followed that night of shattering, the 5 sisters entered a new phase of their shared madness. They seemed to have passed beyond the need for human interaction, beyond the need for sustenance, beyond language itself. The final descent had begun. The most immediate change was their refusal to eat. The servants, what few of them remained, would prepare trays of food and leave them outside the doors of the rooms where the sisters had gathered. The trays would sit untouched for hours, then for days. The food would grow cold, and then it would begin to spoil. The sisters had no interest in it. They seemed to be drawing nourishment from another source, from the air itself, from the ceaseless sound of the sea that now filled the house. Dr. Samuel Aldrich visited every day, his heart heavy with a sense of utter futility. He was no longer a physician. He was a witness. He tried to reason with them. He tried to plead. He held a spoon of broth to Margaret's lips, begging her to take just a little. She looked at him with eyes that held no recognition. It was like trying to reason with a statue. Her face was gaunt, her skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, but her gaze was serene, distant, focused on something far beyond the ruined room. They had moved beyond hunger. They had moved beyond the needs of the body. Their silence was the next thing to deepen. The fractured, choral speech they had shared was gone. They no longer spoke at all. Not to the servants, not to Dr. Aldrich, and not even to each other. The house, once filled with their strange, unfinished sentences, was now utterly mute, save for the wind and the waves. But their silence was not passive. It was a concentrated, active silence. They were communicating in a new way, a way that required no words. They still moved with a disquieting unity, a single mind governing 5 bodies, but now their purpose seemed more focused, more intense. This new purpose manifested on the walls. They began to draw. They used whatever they could find. A piece of charcoal from a cold hearth, a loose nail to scratch into the plaster, even their own fingernails, which they wore down until their fingertips were raw and bloody. And they drew one thing, over and over again, in every room they occupied. They drew concentric circles. They covered the walls of their bedrooms, the grand ballroom, the library. The elegant wallpaper, now stained and peeling from the damp, was covered in these obsessive, repeating patterns. Some were small, no bigger than a coin. Others were enormous, covering an entire wall, a swirling vortex of interlocking rings. They were not drawn with any artistic flair. They were drawn with a frantic, desperate precision, as if they were trying to solve a complex mathematical problem. As if they were charting something. Dr. Aldrich studied the circles for hours. He saw them not as a symptom of madness, but as a form of map-making. They looked like ripples in a pond. They looked like the growth rings of an ancient tree. They looked like the orbits of planets around a sun. He felt he was looking at a diagram of an alien cosmology, a blueprint for a world he could not comprehend. And then, one day, as he stood on the shore below the mansion, watching the tide pull away from the rocks, he understood. The patterns were not of ponds or planets. They were patterns of the tide. The concentric circles were a visual representation of the ebb and flow of the water, the cyclical pull of the moon on the great body of the Atlantic. The sisters were not just drawing circles. They were charting the sea. They were transcribing its language onto the walls of their dying home. They were preparing. The downfall accelerated. The sisters grew visibly weaker. Their bodies were emaciated. Their skin had a pale, translucent quality. They were fading, becoming more ethereal, more ghost-like with each passing day. The servants, one by one, could bear it no longer. They packed their meager belongings and fled the house of horrors, leaving their wages behind. Soon, only Eleanor Cresswell and Dr. Aldrich were left to bear witness. Eleanor had become a ghost herself, a silent, gray figure moving through the ruined rooms of her home. Her pride was gone, shattered like the window panes. All that remained was a mother's helpless, silent grief. She would sit in a chair in the corner of a room for hours, just watching her daughters as they scratched their endless circles on the walls. She did not try to stop them anymore. She knew it was useless. The first of the sisters to disappear was Catherine. It happened on a Tuesday night, exactly 4 weeks after the storm. The night was calm and moonless, the sky a black, starless canopy. Dr. Aldrich had left the mansion late after making his usual futile rounds. Eleanor had retired to her own room, the only one in the house with its windows boarded up against the wind and the dark. The 4 remaining sisters were gathered in the ballroom, scratching their title charts on the plaster by the light of a single, guttering candelabra. The next morning, Catherine was gone. There was no sign of a struggle. No sound had been heard in the night. The heavy front door was unlocked, swinging gently in the morning breeze. She had simply vanished. Her sisters did not seem to notice her absence. They continued their work as if nothing had happened. There were now 4 of them, instead of 5, but their collective purpose remained undiminished. They simply closed the gap in their formation and continued to draw. A frantic search was organized. Dr. Aldrich and a few brave men from the town searched the grounds around the mansion. They searched the woods that bordered the estate. They walked the shoreline for miles, their eyes scanning the rocks and the waves. They found nothing. No footprints in the damp earth. No scrap of torn clothing. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the night air. The disappearance of Catherine cast a new and more terrible pall over the house. The madness had entered a new, active phase. It was no longer contained within the walls. It was now a force that could reach in and take one of them away. The fear was that it would come back for the others. That fear was realized the very next night. This time, it was Margaret, the eldest, the one who had heard the whispers first. The same chilling pattern repeated itself. A quiet, moonless night, a silent house, an unlocked door in the morning, and an empty space where a sister had been. Now there were only 3, Elizabeth, Anne, and Mary. 3 skeletal figures, their eyes wide and dark in their hollowed faces, their bloody fingers still tracing the patterns of the tide on the walls. The loss of their 2 eldest sisters did not seem to affect them at all. Their focus was absolute. It was as if Margaret and Catherine had not disappeared, but had graduated. As if they had completed their work and moved on to the next stage. A new, more desperate search was mounted for Margaret. The whole town was now involved, gripped by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They searched for 2 days. They found nothing. She was gone, just like her sister, swallowed by the silence and the sea. On the 3rd night after Margaret's disappearance, Dr. Aldrich could not bring himself to leave the mansion. He could not leave the 3 remaining girls alone with their grieving mother and the open, waiting dark. He decided to keep a vigil. He sat in a hard-backed chair in the main hallway, his worn leather bag on the floor beside him. He kept the gas lamps burning low. The house was a wreck around him. The wind moaned through the broken windows, carrying the scent of salt and damp earth. The sound of the waves on the shore was a constant, rhythmic whisper. He must have dozed off. He was woken by a sound. It was not a loud sound. It was a faint, scratching noise coming from upstairs. It was a familiar sound, the sound of fingernails on plaster. But it was coming from a place where the sisters were not supposed to be. It was coming from the attic. A cold dread, sharper and more intense than any he had felt before, seized him. He grabbed a lamp and started up the grand, sweeping staircase, his steps echoing in the vast, empty space. He made his way through the darkened upper floor, the scratching sound growing louder, more frantic, as he approached the narrow, steep stairs that led to the attic. He climbed the stairs, his hand trembling on the rough wooden railing. He pushed open the heavy attic door. The air that met him was thick with the smell of dust, old wood, and the sea. The attic was a vast, cavernous space, filled with the shadowy shapes of forgotten furniture and shrouded heirlooms. The only light was from his own lamp, which cast a pool of trembling gold on the rough floorboards, and in the center of that light, he saw them: Elizabeth, Anne, and Mary. They were huddled together, their backs to him. They were on their knees before one of the massive, rough-hewn wooden beams that supported the roof. Their hands were a blur of motion. They were scratching at the wood. Their fingernails, already worn to the quick, were bleeding freely, leaving dark, wet streaks on the pale timber. They were so absorbed in their task that they did not hear him enter. He moved closer, holding the lamp high. He saw what they were carving. It was not the concentric circles from downstairs. It was something new. A more complex pattern of flowing, interconnected lines, swirling and turning back on themselves. It was a diagram of terrifying complexity and beauty. He recognized it instantly. He had seen it 1,000 times in his life. He had seen it in the patterns the foam left on the sand as the water receded. He had seen it in the swirling eddies of the current around the pilings of the town pier. He was looking at a perfect, intricate map of the ocean's tides. They were carving the soul of the sea into the bones of the house. He took another step forward, and his foot scuffed on the floor. They heard him. All three of them stopped their work. At the exact same moment, they turned their heads slowly, in perfect unison, and they looked at him. Their faces were skeletal, their eyes enormous, black pools of madness and ecstasy. They were not his patients anymore. They were not human. They were priestesses of a dark, watery god. Dr. Aldrich stumbled back, his courage failing him. He fled from the attic, down the stairs, out of the house, and into the night. He did not stop until he reached the safety of his own study. He collapsed into his chair, his body shaking uncontrollably. He opened his journal, his hand so unsteady that his script was almost illegible. He described the scene in the attic. He described the symbols. He wrote that they were patterns of the tide. He tried to understand what it meant. He realized that the sisters were not just charting the sea, they were following it. The circles downstairs were the lessons. The patterns in the attic were the final examination. And he knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, what the next step was. The journey that had begun with a whisper in the walls was about to reach its final destination. He dipped his pen in the ink, trying to write down the terrible conclusion that had formed in his mind. He wrote, his hand shaking, "If they follow it into the water," and there, his final entry ended. The pen slipped from his fingers. The sentence was left unfinished. A hanging question, a cliffhanger poised on the edge of an unthinkable horror. The story of what happened next was not his to write. It belonged to the sea. Time has a way of burying stories. It grinds stone to dust and splinters wood to nothing. Houses fall. Memories fade. The tragic tale of the Cresswell daughters became a ghost story, a whispered legend told by the firesides of Bar Harbor to frighten children. The once grand mansion on the point of land was left to the wind and the sea. Its broken windows stared out like the vacant eyes of a skull. The paint peeled, the roof sagged, and the wild roses grew over the crumbling verandas. For decades, it stood as a silent, decaying monument to a forgotten sorrow. The world moved on. The 19th century bled into the 20th. The town of Bar Harbor grew and changed. The age of sail gave way to the age of steam, and then to engines that burned gasoline. The story of the 5 sisters who went mad became part of the local folklore, a quaint and chilling piece of the town's history, its sharp edges worn smooth by the passage of years. No one knew what had happened to the last 3 sisters, Elizabeth, Anne, and Mary. Like their older siblings, they had simply vanished. Their mother, Eleanor Cresswell, lived out her remaining years as a recluse in the boarded-up east wing of the ruin, a gray ghost in her own mausoleum, cared for by a distant cousin until her death. The house was sold for taxes, then sold again, but no one ever dared to live there. It was a place of profound and unsettling stillness. The official record, the one written in the town's ledger, was simple. It listed the 5 Cresswell daughters as deceased, with the cause of death noted as lost at sea. It was a neat, tidy explanation. It closed the book on a difficult and embarrassing chapter, but the truth, as is so often the case, was not buried in a ledger. It was waiting patiently in the dark. The year was 1952. More than 70 years had passed since the night of the glass rain. A wealthy family from Boston, charmed by the location but not the legend, bought the Cresswell property with the intention of tearing down the old ruin and building a modern summer home. Before the demolition began, a team of workmen was sent into the derelict mansion to salvage anything of value. They were practical men, not given to flights of fancy. They wore heavy boots and carried crowbars. They saw the house not as a haunted place, but as a job to be done. They worked their way through the collapsing floors and debris-strewn rooms. They found little of worth. The silver was gone. The fine furniture was rotted beyond repair. The grand piano was a wreck of warped wood and yellowed keys. The house had been thoroughly reclaimed by nature. It was on the 3rd day of their work that they made their way to the attic. The steep, narrow stairs groaned under their weight. The air upstairs was thick and stale, heavy with the dust of 7 decades. Sunlight streamed in through holes in the sagging roof, illuminating swirling columns of dust. And it was there, tucked away under the eaves, behind a stack of rotting trunks and broken chairs, that they found it. It was a single, sea-worn trunk, made of dark, heavy wood and bound with rusted iron straps. Unlike the others, it was locked. Curiosity piqued. One of the workmen took his crowbar and pried the old lock open. The rusted metal shrieked in protest and then snapped. They lifted the heavy lid. The men expected to find moth-eaten clothes or tarnished silver. Instead, they found a small, meticulously arranged archive of a tragedy. The trunk was not full. It contained only 2 sets of items. On one side, stacked neatly and tied with a faded ribbon, was a series of leather-bound journals. On the other side were 5 thin, simple dresses. They were made of fine white cotton, the style of a bygone era. They were folded with a careful, precise hand. One of the workmen, a man named George, reached in and picked one up. The fabric was stiff and brittle. It was caked with a fine white powder that flaked off onto his hands. He brought it to his nose. The The smell was faint but unmistakable. It was the smell of dried sea salt. It was as if the dresses had been soaked in the ocean and then left to dry in the sun. They were the nightgowns the sisters had been wearing. Someone had found them, washed them, folded them, and placed them here. The other workman, a younger man named David, picked up the journals. He wiped the dust from the green leather cover of the topmost volume. The gold leaf lettering was faded but still legible. It read, "The Private Notes of Dr. Samuel Aldrich." He opened the book. The pages were filled with a neat, slanted script that was dense and difficult to read. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the detailed, dispassionate account of fevers, remedies, and the slow, creeping horror that had consumed the Cresswell family. He read about Margaret's whispers. He read about the night of the glass rain. He read about the concentric circles and the patterns of the tide carved into the attic beams right above their heads. He turned to the final journal in the stack. It was thinner than the others. Many of its pages were blank. He found the last entry, the one that ended mid-sentence. "If they follow it into the water," the words hung on the page, a testament to the doctor's final, terrible realization. But it was not the last thing written in the book. He turned the page. The very last page of the very last journal was not blank. It bore a single line of text. It was written in the center of the page. The sentence was short. It was simple. It said, "We are all awake now." But it was the handwriting that made the blood run cold in the workman's veins. It was not the doctor's neat, slanted script. It was 5 different hands. The first word, "we," was written in a graceful, looping cursive. The second word, "are," was written in a sharp, angular print. The third word, "all," was small and precise. The fourth, "awake," was a frantic, sloping scrawl. And the final word, "now," was written in a shaky, almost childlike hand. 5 words, 5 sisters. A final, collective message left for whoever might find it. It was a declaration. It was a statement of arrival. They had not been lost at sea. They had reached their destination. The 2 workmen stood in the dusty attic, the silence pressing in on them. The story they had always known as a local legend suddenly felt terrifyingly real. This trunk was not folklore. It was evidence. It was a found document, a final testament. The doctor's journals told the story of the descent. The 5 folded dresses were the proof of the journey. And the final, chilling sentence on the last page was a message from the other side. They packed up the trunk carefully. They knew this was something more than salvage. This was something for the Historical Society, a piece of the town's soul they had unearthed. As they left the house for the last time that day, the sun was beginning to set over the Atlantic. The sky was turning a brilliant, fiery orange. The sea was calm. They locked the ruined mansion's front door behind them and walked down the long, overgrown drive to their truck. And as they did, they both heard it. At first, they thought it was the wind or the cry of distant gulls, but the air was still. The sound was too clear, too musical. It was a sound that carried across the water from somewhere far out on the horizon. It was the sound of singing. It was faint, ethereal, and hauntingly beautiful. It was not one voice. It was 5. 5 distinct voices woven together in a strange, unearthly harmony. They were singing a song with no words, a melody that seemed as old as the tides themselves. The 2 men stopped and looked at each other, their faces pale in the twilight. They looked out at the sea, at the place where the water met the sky. There was nothing there, just the endless, empty expanse of the ocean. But the singing continued, rising and falling with the gentle rhythm of the waves, a final, impossible revelation. The Cresswell sisters were not gone. They were just no longer visible. They had followed the patterns of the tide into the water, and they were, at last, all awake. The case file on the Cresswell daughters is now closed. Thank you for bearing witness with us. Join the community by subscribing, and you'll be here when we open the next one.